Hi, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Sprue, a miniature painting and scale model hobbying channel where we'll go beyond the Sprue and get every miniature and model painted. Today I'll be tackling a box of Valentine tanks from the Plastic Soldier Company. These are perfect for many tabletop war games like Flames of War, What a Tanker, and my personal favourite, Battle Group. The models went together very easily, and there were no gaps to be filled up, and the details on the model are great, at least to a tabletop standard. One last note about the kit is that it can be made into Mark IIs, Mark IIIs, or Mark IXs. I've built mine as Mark IIs, and by switching out the turrets, Mark IXs. For Mark IIIs, you'd also need to have the alternate hull top and the different track configuration. So, on to the paint job. All we're doing is trying to get these to a playable, tabletop standard that you can both be proud of, but is quick and easy. I've chosen to paint these up in a desert scheme to keep it simple and be able to use them in the mid-war. To start with, we're going to prime the miniatures with a combo paint primer from Rust-Oleum. It's an ultra-flat rattle can that bonds plastic and is a great sand color. It's cheap as chips compared to the hobby brands and can be found at big box DIY stores here in the US. Before doing so, we're mounting the hulls on small leftover wooden blocks I have kicking around, and the turrets on these large tongue depressors. You can use anything you want to mount these on. This will help with painting odd angles, and make sure that there's much less mess whilst spraying primer, and it will also prevent us from touching the model as much during the painting process. And bam! Note how nice and matte they are, just how we want them to be. So let's get straight into things, and start with Army Painter's Dark Tone Wash. We're going to apply this all over the models, starting with the lower hull and road wheels, making sure to get into all the cracks, crevices, and recesses. We're starting with these parts, as it's less of a big deal if we make a mistake here, because it'll be less obvious. This shade will give us some contrast and act as fake shadows and highlights to help to define all the details all over the tank, of which there are quite a lot on this particular kit. Take care to not let the wash pool on the flat surfaces as much as possible, where shadows wouldn't be. That being said, at this small scale, it's not the end of the world. Any mistakes or horrible excess can be removed with a clean, damp brush that will wick away the excess wash. Just make sure to do that as soon as possible so you don't leave any stains or ring marks from leftover wash that's half dried. Now before you start sweating thinking, what has happened to my tanks? We're going to use a sand color to dry brush the model. I'm using Tamiya XF57 Buff, but any light sand color you have will do great. You can pick a warmer color with more yellow, or a cooler desaturated color like a deck tan, depending on your preferences. If you've never dry brushed, you're going to load up the brush with paint, then wipe almost all of it off on a paper towel, and then roughly brush back and forth onto the model. It'll deposit the paint only on raised details and edges, which will bump the contrast against the shade and the main base tone, and toning down the darker shade. Here you can see the difference this makes. Now that's done, we're going to use a dark grey paint to get some details onto the model, and also the dregs. I'm actually using a craft paint called Pavement, because I love the colour and the way that it takes shade. It's hard to use and needs a little bit of work to dilute down properly because the pigments aren't very good, but any strong dark grey colour will be excellent. With this colour, we're doing the tracks, road wheels, tools, flimsy cans, and exhaust pipes. I'll also add a touch onto the ends of the gun barrels to simulate gun smoke. It's stylized and a little bit excessive, but I think it looks good on a big wargame table, especially from distance. Once that's dry, we're going to shade those parts too. You could use the same strong tone we've already used, but I'm using Citadel's Nuln Oil, as it stains other paints to a greater degree, so it will darken the tracks nicely. We do want to be careful, especially around the hull sides and fenders, because we don't want to make a big mess with this. Now the shade is dry, it's time to apply decals. I love adding decals, especially on Allied and Soviet tanks that are often painted in a single tone like green or olive or sand. Decals are a great way to get some vibrant colour on the models and make them just a bit more interesting. These ones are going to be done as desert rats. This kit doesn't come with decals, so they are sourced from Battlefront ones that I already have. Before we apply the decals, let's take a look at some old Shermans of mine to learn a few lessons. On this first one, you can see the decals are shiny compared to the matte paint and look awful. And on the second one, the squadron marking just flaked off, and the divisional markings are poorly placed and they're in bad shape and half hanging off. To combat these things, we're going to apply a gloss varnish to the models. Krylon Color Max Clear is very cheap and available at any DIY store. Once the gloss is fully cured, typically overnight is how long I leave it, it's time to apply the decals proper. Let me introduce you to Microset and Microsol, your water slide transfer buddies. Seriously, buy these and they last your lifetime, but will make every difference in how your decals look. Firstly, drop your decals into a small amount of water. After a few minutes, they'll be able to slide off their backing and onto the model. Before we do that, we're going to apply some Microset to the surface of the model, only where we're going to place the decals. This will help to keep the decals in place and not to flake off. I use tweezers to pick up the decals and then use a clean paintbrush to push and slide them onto the tank. Whilst it's still wet, you can use the brush to push them around and get them lined up and into place. Once that's placed where you want it, I dry the brush and then use it to wick away any excess water that may have built up on the surface. And then the next step is to use the microsol and apply it on top of the newly placed decals. Microsol softens the decals. You may be able to see the decals wrinkle on large models, which looks a little bit scary, but it'll contract back into a normal size after it's conformed to the surface of the model. This is important because it means that the decals can go over panel lines, rounded turrets, and rivet detail without gaps behind it, giving that painted-on look. I'll be honest, my decal set is an older one, and some of them just disintegrate, which is a pain, but luckily I have a lot more, enough to get everything done. Newer sets that I've used do not do this. Let those decals cure. I usually leave them overnight just to be extra cautious. And then we're going to hit everything with a layer of Tester's Dull Coat, which is a lacquer-based matte varnish. Make sure you're outside for this because the lacquer-based sprays smell terrible and you don't want to breathe any of that in. Once that's cured again, overnight, we're all set. These are table ready, with them being 1/100 scale, and how many you'll have on the table, there's not really much need to get into the minutiae of scale modeling. If you want to give it another round of dusty dry brushing on the tracks, just to give it that deserty weathered look, feel free, but if speed is of the essence, then we'll call it a wrap and start playing. Thanks for sticking out to the end of the video. If you found it useful, feel free to subscribe for more videos in the future, and follow Sprue on Twitter and Instagram for ongoing projects, works in progress, and much more. And once again, thank you.